Welcome to Table Talk, the place for deep conversations in the Geekverse. And trust me, when we tear into a subject, we go deep. I'm Heath, and I'll be your host. Each episode, I'll be talking with one or more creators, authors, illustrators, publishers, or other movers and shakers in games, TV, books, movies, or other areas of the Geekverse. Regular guests include Douglas A. Burton, the author of Faraway Bird, a multi-award-winning historical fiction novel of the Byzantine Empress Theodora. He's also the author of The Heroine's Labyrinth, an alternative story structure to the hero's journey that often occurs in stories with feminine heroes. That structural framework frequently comes up in our analysis of story. Brianna De Silva, she's the director and co-writer of The Cultists, a Lovecraftian comedy mockumentary-style web show here on YouTube. And the author of The City of Reckoning, an epic fantasy novel of political intrigue, the ethics of war, and young love. Cameron Pasha is a screenwriter, director, novelist, and was a writer and producer on the series Kings, a producer on NBC's Bionic Woman, and a co-producer and writer for Sleeper Cell. He's also written for the CW series Nikita and Roswell, New Mexico. He's been breaking news from inside Lucasfilm, Disney, and Hollywood. His analysis and commentary have become very popular on YouTube. We regularly meet to discuss and analyze stories, and when we do, we dive into graduate-level seminars on story structure and writing. Come on in and let's go deep. And when I say we're going deep, I mean you'd better bring your hard suit. Other guests have included Lou Anders, the author of the Thrones and Bones fantasy novels Once Upon a Unicorn, the creator and publisher of the Norengard RPG, and the author of Star Wars: A Pirate's Price, the book that explains why the Millennium Falcon is on the planet Batu at Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Mark Tassin, the creator of the World of Ataltis, head of Mechanical Muse, former director of the Gen Con Writers Symposium, and the head developer of the new Cool Name RPG. Let's see, who else?
Bond. James Bond.
Well, not James Bond. Not yet. Maybe soon, though. But I have interviewed Jamie Stegmaier, the founder of Stonemaier Games, crowdfunder extraordinaire, and publisher of many-hit board games like Scythe and Wingspan. Brian Colin, sculptor of the world of Revelo Monster Busts, and the creator of the vast grim dark horror RPG. Ajit George, the Dungeons & Dragons author. We talked about game writing, education, and his contribution to Van Richter's Guide to Ravenloft and the development of the Journeys to the Radiant Citadel.
I am Hela, Odin's firstborn, the commander of the legions of Asgard, the rightful heir to the throne, and the goddess of death.
Well, actually, that interview got rather spicy, so I think I'd better just keep that one to myself. Kate Wilson, a YouTuber, actress, host, and prolific geek guru who's now working to make a new show dedicated to the world of tabletop gaming a reality. So buckle up and get ready for a wild ride, because it's time to explore the worlds of tabletop gaming, sci-fi, fantasy, and all of geekdom through the eyes of those who are making things happen.
Atomic batteries to power. Turbines to speed.
Roger. Ready to move out.
It's time for Table Talk. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Table Talk. I'm Heath. I'll be your host. Welcome to my home. Welcome to the office, and welcome to Table Talk. This is going to be a fantastic show this evening because we're going to be talking to an individual who is very well known and very popular here in the Geekverse, Justin Alexander, and he is right now releasing his new book, So You Want to Be a Game Master, right here. I've got a copy right here, and this is a gigantic tome of a book right here on game mastery. I've been reading it. We checked it on the morning grind this morning. I've been reading it this afternoon in preparation for the discussion today. So we have got a lot to talk about. So let me go ahead and bring him on. Might as well. Welcome, Justin. Welcome.
Hello. Glad to be here. Great to see you.
It is fantastic to have you here. We had a fantastic time. Well, we have referenced your material for the Alexandrian blog quite a bit on the morning grind. We've been doing studies of different things in tabletop and game design, and then it was enjoying your book as well. So you're no stranger to the community around here.
Well, I'm a big fan of the channel too. So
thank you. I want to point out to everybody before we get deep in here that we are streaming in two locations at the moment on the Table Talk channel. This is a new channel that we're branding Table Talk as its own thing. So if you are looking or are on Heath's Geekverse, the permanent home of this live stream will be on the new Table Talk channel. I just put a link to that over here. You can see we're right here. It would really help us out over here to subscribe to that channel and also get us some watch hours over here on this channel. All of this is Table Talk. We stream on Tuesdays and Thursday nights, and we've got clips that come out just about every day of the different conversations that we do. So we've been getting Table Talk going on over here, but we can take super chats over on Heath's Geekverse. We're not monetized over on Table Talk yet, but if you have a direction you'd like to take the conversation, you can send a super chat on the Heath's Geekverse channel. We're simultaneously streaming, but I'll turn the stream private on the Heath's Geekverse channel. Table Talk will be its permanent home. And also, I'll point out this morning, if you want to know more about this book, we did an hour and a half on how So You Want to Be a Game Master. And like we were going through the very beginning and the introduction and trying to understand this book. It was about an hour and a half live stream this morning. So search for Morning Grind. So You Want to Be a Game Master. If you actually want to get even into the book, we worked for about an hour and a half, I think, going through this, and we got through about like this much of the book. So it was fantastic to find out everything that was in there. And I think a lot of people were like, oh, well, then I've got to get this book because it was so interesting. But Justin, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? I'll bring up the page for Amazon right here. So You Want to Be a Game Master, and I'll put this in the link. But do you want to introduce yourself and tell everybody who you are and what you're doing and why you're here?
Sure thing. I never know how to talk about myself, but I've been a GM for a little over 4 decades. I've been a freelancer and creator in the RPG industry since the late 90s. I have previously worked for companies like Steve Jackson Games, Fantasy Flight Games, Troll Lord Games. Most recently, I was the co-designer of the Infinity RPG from Modiphius Publishing, and also Magical Kitty Save the Day from Atlas Games. I have a website called The Alexandrian, which focuses a lot on role-playing game content.
Got that right.
It is an ENnie award-winning website. Won a Silver ENnie a few years back for my work on the website there. And most recently, as you said, we're kind of book buddies here. Obviously, I also have my copy here. I have a new book coming out, called So You Want to Be a Game Master. It's kind of a big milestone for me because it's being released by Page Street Publishing and Macmillan, which means it's being distributed globally, and it's being distributed into local bookstores and Barnes & Noble and Amazon and pretty much anywhere you can find your favorite books, as well as local game stores as well. So I'm really hoping this book is a chance to reach out to a lot of people who are interested in becoming game masters or longtime veteran game masters, and show them some of the tricks and tips I've learned over the years.
And you are also on YouTube as well. So we got the Alexandrian YouTube channel. So we're broadcasting on several different platforms. But if you're on YouTube, you've got YouTube videos too.
That's right. Yes, I do have a YouTube channel. I also do Twitch streams, hypothetically weekly. So I am a multitude. I am vast. I contain multitudes.
All right. All right. So those are the links going out. I was like looking at everybody here. We got James here. Welcome. We got a great crew tonight. Please do hit the like button here. So regardless of what stream you're on, please hit the like button. That way YouTube knows that this is a good stream, and to push this out to other people who may be subscribed and sitting there on YouTube this evening right now and would like to be here, but YouTube's might not be showing them the stream. So hit the like button. So maybe the algorithm kicks it out to some more people who would like to be here. So good evening, Daniel. We got Daniel as well here. I see Druden Fuzz. He's up late night here, sacrificing because he's a fan of the Alexandrian YouTube channel. So I understand that. So we appreciate everybody who is here. Zero the Blade is here. Charlie is here. We got Sable Phoenix is here. Great crew. BGD. Welcome. All right, Pool Noodles. Hello. Welcome. Okay. I'll take this down then. And I got tons of notes from this morning and so forth and different things to talk about. And if you got stuff, put it in the chat. But let's go ahead and start with this idea of this book. So You Want to Be a Game Master. Who is this book for and what's its purpose?
Well, the primary audience for this book is the person who wants to become a game master and doesn't really know what the first step should be. It's the book that I wanted to own when I was 10, 11 years old and trying to become a game master for the first time. And I was really kind of like casting around wildly, trying to find somebody who would just tell me, this is the thing you do, and then you'll be playing the game. Because a lot of role-playing games, for better or worse, don't really give the game master a lot of guidance. They may have advice and that kind of stuff about things like listen to your players or think about what your story should be. And some of that advice is really good. And some of that advice I don't necessarily always agree with. But what a lot of that advice has in common is that it's not really telling you what is the specific thing, what is the concrete set of steps that you can take to become a game master, to do the things you want. And so a big focus of this book is to say, okay, this is exactly what you prep in order to create your adventure or your scenario. And then this is exactly how you use the stuff you prepped at the game table in order to create a game session with your players, to make it that specific, to make it a step-by-step sort of procedural guide. And then so that's the initial audience, but the book is also designed to kind of be a GM's survival guide. So whether you're a new GM working through the book step-by-step or a veteran GM who's looking for advanced tips and tricks and new types of adventures to run for your players, the book is kind of a handy guide that will hopefully be by your side for years of running games.
What is the difference between this book and, for instance, the D&D DMG, the Dungeon Master Guide?
That's a great question. So, like, there are some very specific concrete differences in approach. I think that might be the best way to look at it. So if you open up the 5th edition DMG, for example, the first thing you're going to see is they're going to say, hey, create an entire world. Start by defining who your gods are and what the planes of existence are. And that's all really cool stuff. And like, I enjoy world building as well. But in terms of like, how do I actually play this game? That advice is not necessarily the strongest. And in fact, the 5th edition DMG, I don't like harsh anybody's vibe per se, but the 5th edition DMG is actually one of the worst DMGs in terms of all the Dungeon Master's guides that have existed since 1979. Wow. It's one of the worst ones in terms of actually teaching the Dungeon Master what you're specifically going to do. And a good example of this is the teaching of how dungeons work. So like if you look inside the 5th edition Dungeon Master's guide, it was kind of shocking to me when I realized this, you can find that not only do they not tell you how to key a dungeon map, for example, like a really basic skill for creating a dungeon adventure, right? Not only they don't tell you how to key a dungeon map, there's not even an example of a keyed map in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So like these are basic skills that I think the designers just kind of subconsciously assumed, well, everybody knows how to run a dungeon. But the reality is that if you're a first-time gamer, you don't necessarily know how to run a dungeon or how to run other types of scenarios. And so that's a big place where this book is really going to kind of like focus. Is the book starts out by saying, we're going to start with a dungeon scenario, because I think a dungeon scenario is actually really good for first-time game masters because it firewalls each individual room. Like when you're running a dungeon, a basic dungeon, you can really just think about that sort of the room that you're in and not have to think about the wider dungeon, which kind of simplifies everything for the game master, which is great for everybody, but particularly for new GMs. And so we start with that and say, look, let's run a basic dungeon. These are the specific things you need to do to run a dungeon. These are the specific skills you need to run a dungeon. You need to know how to make rulings, and you need to know how to run a room. And once you know those two things, you can run your first scenario. And in fact, here's a scenario, and you should go run this first scenario with those basic skills to get a feel for what actually happens at the table. And here's specifically things you'll be doing at the table. And then you can come back and we talk about how to design dungeons, for example. Now, we do that with dungeons, but then we also do that with mysteries and raids and heists and urban adventures and wilderness exploration as well. So there's a whole bunch of things where we look through that specific process of this is what you prep, and this is how you use that prep at the table.
So, okay, so well, you may have kind of answered this, but so what were you trying to accomplish with it? You're trying to make game mastering more accessible?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly it. I want game mastering to be more accessible, and I want to give game masters the tools they need to create the adventures and scenarios that they want to run at the table. And in particular, I really want to help guide game masters into a form of play that I call active play, which is rather than prepping plots or predetermining what needs to happen during your session, you instead prep tools or toys that you get to play with during the session with your players. That the players bring their characters and they're actively playing those characters at the table, and you respond to their play by playing with them using the various toys that you've prepped, rather than trying to force them into the predetermined sequence of events that you wanted them to go through.
Okay, that's some very interesting terminology that we encountered when we were looking at the book on the Morning Grind, and it was brought up in the chat as well, when you're talking about creating toys. So what does that mean, and how does that help you as a game master?
Well, so I find the toy metaphor to really work well for a lot of people, and it really is about the fact that if you think about what a toy is an object that you can use in lots of different ways to facilitate your imaginative play, right? Like my daughter, when she's sitting there with her Barbie dolls, there's not a script that she's following. There's not a predetermined sequence of events that her Barbies and her dinosaurs are going to act out. And as a result, on one day, she might have her Barbie dolls hunting the Triceratops, which I've seen, or she might have them taming the Brontosauruses and riding the Brontosauruses into the shopping center. And that's all kind of just different ways you can use these toys. And within the context of a role-playing game, you can have the same mindset where you say, I'm not prepping an adventure in which I say, okay, well, the PCs are going to break in through the back door of the mafia boss's house. They are going to go confront him in his office, and he's going to leap off the balcony and catch onto a helicopter and fly away, for example. What you're going to say instead is there is a house, and there is a mafia boss, and there is a helicopter that he uses for escapes. And maybe that's what happens during play, but maybe you find other ways to use those toys. Maybe the house becomes a place where the PCs go to negotiate with the mafia boss, or the PCs sneak onto the property and put plastic explosives around the house and blow it up. Or maybe they hijack the helicopter and fly the mafia boss's own helicopter in. So once you start thinking those toys that you can actively respond to the players with, it becomes free-form creativity. The game can go anywhere. You get to be surprised, and the players get to be surprised, and you get to discover the game together.
Okay. So what caused you to write the book? What was your inspiration in sitting down to create a book like this?
Well, I've been working on the Alexandrian for a number of years with lots of different articles talking about different aspects of game mastering. And about 5-6 years ago, I began having this idea for this book called So You Want to Be a Game Master. And what I was specifically reacting to was I was getting a lot of comments from first-time GMs who were saying, I love the material on the Alexandrian, but I don't know where to start. And that made sense because the Alexandrian was really being written for an audience of people who were experienced game masters. It was a lot of advanced advice and the like. And so people who were becoming GMs for the first time were finding things on the site that they really enjoyed, but the material wasn't necessarily written to make it the most accessible possible for them. And so I said, there's a way to do this. And I also, like I said before, I really wanted to have the book that I wish I had when I was getting started gaming in 1989, where I wanted a book that would just tell me, this is what you need to do. And so I knew that there was a way of presenting game mastering that was not sort of arcane secrets and like weird veils and like a shrouded room you go into and like something mysterious happens over there. There's a way to think about game mastery, which, like I said, is procedural. That is, these are the simple steps that you can follow. You can learn how to make a ruling. These are the steps you use to make a ruling. This is how you can use the elements in a room in a dungeon to play with the players actively at the table. And so this is what you prep in the dungeon, and this is how you use that room, use that knowledge of how to make rulings at the table to respond to what the players are telling you in terms of proposing actions and the like. And so there was a book that I wanted when I was 10, and that was the book that I wanted to create. And I also wanted to create a book that would be accessible to these people who were coming to me and saying, I don't know where to start. And I wanted to give people a place to start.
BGD has a great question here. BGD asks, question, to your point about the 5e DMG, would you agree that the poor instructional quality of the current DMG has to do with Hasbro's evolution of D&D toward more of a player focus than a DM focus? This would underpin the need for more books like yours, given this unfortunate in the world's most popular RPG evolution. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think from what I know, that there's a few factors that go into why the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide is the way it is. And one of this is actually a long-term trend. It didn't start with the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. You can track it back through several Dungeon Master's Guides as sort of basic foundational skills of how to run a dungeon, for example, which is just one example, but how to run a dungeon, for example, kind of drop out of the book. And I don't think it's like a corporate strategy per se. Like sometimes people will also say to me like, oh, well, if they don't teach you how to make a dungeon, then they can sell you dungeons. I'm like, yeah, I guess that's true. But like they keep publishing books with dungeons in them, so maybe they should like still teach you how to run a dungeon, and they don't do that either. So I think what's really going on is that what you have is people who've been, running and making role-playing games for decades, and they've been doing it so long that they just think, hey, everybody knows how to run a dungeon. And the reality is that not everybody actually does know how to make and run a dungeon. And so those sort of foundational skills, they just don't think they need to be included in the book, and they may not even really think about them anymore. They may have become sort of ingrained pretty deep. It's kind of like if you went to like I'm going to use a sports analogy here. Like if you went to an NFL quarterback and you said, hey, can you teach a completely new kid how to like throw the ball? And they might be able, like some of them will be good teachers and can like make that leap, but some experts will have a real difficult time putting themselves back into the mindset of the first time person who's never done this before, and will have difficult. And that's that can be true of football or role playing games or like physics professors across the board, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's part of it. And I think the other thing to keep in mind too with the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide is that based on what we've heard in interviews from people who were involved in the creation of that book, it was done on a very tight time frame. They put a lot of effort into play testing the player's handbook and making sure the mechanics of the game were all there. And then they were like, oh, we also need to produce a 300-page Dungeon Master's Guide in a few months. And so the game itself, the mechanics got a lot of thought and play testing. And I think that is a place where I think Dungeon Master Guides in general don't get that kind of play testing focus. And maybe that would actually be a good thing. I haven't really thought about this before, but maybe it would be a good thing to like think of the fact that Dungeon Master's Guides need to be play tested, because the GM is also playing a game, even if it's just procedures and the way we create things rather than necessarily hard mechanics per se.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have not been very deep into the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide because I guess I found it unnecessary. Although sometimes people are like, oh, well, there is an optional rule and you're asking for something. And there is actually the optional rule in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I'm like, oh, well, then, okay, I should check it out. So occasionally there's more in it that like, oh, but it's not a book that I've gone through in great detail like I remember some of the other guides. But I wonder if some of that is like, well, if you've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since like AD&D 2nd edition or before, or D&D, whatever, like, are you going to buy are they thinking, do you need to buy a book about how to run a dungeon? Because that's what we're talking about. The people are just expecting to know how to do that by now.
Well, that may have also influenced the decision-making in terms of, we know that 5th edition, when it was being designed, was very much being designed as an edition where they expected the primary audience to be existing players. They were trying to pull in the 4th edition and 3rd edition and even old school players and pull them into a big tent. Yeah, to recapture that group. And so that was an audience that they were primarily thinking about, and that may have also influenced the decisions about what were in the book. Although, like I say, this idea of like first dungeon procedures and then advice about how to make a dungeon, and then, like I say, even now, even how to draw a dungeon map. These are all skills that have kind of dropped out of the GMG. It's a long trend of people just kind of assuming that dungeons, or more broadly location-based adventures, that those skills are obvious in some way. Like another good example of this is if you pick up the 2014 D&D starter set, for example. I think this is true of the new starter set as well. But if you pick up the 2014 starter set, there's like a half page where they like explain carefully to a new DM, hey, this is what box text looks like. And what you do with box text is you read it. And here are some tips for how to best read box text or to use box text at your table. And you're like, oh, that's all really good advice for someone who may not know what box text is, because if you haven't played a role-playing game before, you've never seen.
And this is the starter set.
Right. And like it's kind of funny because we run into that problem with the book, actually. Because like I said, this is coming from Page 3 Publishing. So it goes into layout, and I have notes in there saying, oh, this section of the book should be box text. And the layout person came back and said, I don't know what that is. And I was like, oh, of course you don't. You've laid out nonfiction books, you've laid out fiction books, but you've never laid out a role-playing adventure, so why would you know that? So they have this half page about box text, which is great. And then you flip the page, and there's just a dungeon map sitting there. And like, if you know how to run a dungeon map, it's a great dungeon map. It's got a great key and everything else. But there's zero verbiage in the 2014 starter set saying, hey, this is how a map works. This is how a room key entry works. This is how you read them. This is how you use them. And so like they understood that they needed to explain box text, but the idea that they would need to explain like how to run a dungeon just didn't seem to enter anyone's mind. And again, I don't think like it's not a conscious choice. I think it's so ingrained. Oh yeah, everybody knows how to run a dungeon, that they just don't think about that.
Well, it's probably not something that I thought about, because we review a lot of box sets. I mean, on the Morning Grind on the main channel, He's Geekverse, and we did about 200 days straight where we looked at different RPGs and different box sets and things like that, and looked at them. I don't know that that's actually a topic that specifically had come up. Is that now we tended to like the Pathfinder box sets a lot better, like the Pathfinder starter set. We all like box sets on this channel. It seems like, so we're like, oh wow, look at this. But I'm thinking about that too. I wonder, did Pathfinder do any better? But did Paizo do any better with that?
I haven't actually seen their second edition introductory box set. I remember liking their first edition box set really well, but it's been a while since I took a look at it, so I wouldn't want to necessarily comment on it specifically.
Drudenfuzz, and I'm sorry, I said he. I see the image, but it's tiny when I was scrolling by here, so I'm sorry about that. But Drudenfuzz asked question: would it not be better to the created toys to be directly implemented in the system and thus allow for GM-less play? Oh, so GM-less play. So that's something. So I mean, for example, it's done in Fiasco. There it seems that toys are put into the scenarios and are thus necessarily something, not necessarily something the GM has to prep.
Yeah, so I think what Drudenfuzz is aiming towards, I think she's talking about games that are designed for zero prep. So a good example of this is a game I published actually called Tech Noir, which was designed by Jeremy Keller. And in Tech Noir, you have these transmissions. Tech Noir is a cyberpunk game, and in the game you have these transmissions, and each transmission describes a city. So Los Angeles, for example, in the cyberpunk future, and each of those transmissions is focused on this connections and adversaries and objects and so forth, all of which then can be used within the plot mapping mechanics of the system to generate a plot map at the table, which is the adventure that the PCs will explore. That game uses a GM, but has a zero prep philosophy similar to Fiasco, for example. Another zero prep game I'm actually in the middle of reading right now is Stealing Stories from the Devil from Monte Cook Games, which is a heist-based game, but is designed to be zero prep, that you open the box, and if you know the rules, you can just sit down and start playing without necessarily having a specific scenario in mind. That one works by having, I believe, the players kind of, like, I'm only halfway through it, but works with the players kind of working with the GM so that the heist planning becomes the prepping of the scenario essentially at the table. Those are great ways to do that. I love those games like that, Tech Noir and Stealing Stories from the Devil and so forth. And but I will say that there's also a place, particularly for people who are interested in immersive role play or in exploring a world that has a what do I want to say here? That has a pre-existing creation, that the GM creates a world full of toys to play with, and you go explore that world. That there's a place there for the GM to prep their adventures, prep their scenarios, and create the world and so forth. And even within games like Tech Noir, for example, it's great to have the GM be given the tools to create their own cyberpunk cities, for example, and not be limited just to the particular toys that the designers deliver. But there's a lot of range in that. A great storytelling game, for example, I just played is Alice is Missing, which is really just designed to tell one very specific scenario, and so it puts very specific toys in play for that very specific game experience.
Hey, Jason. Jason is here. Welcome. Good evening. Jason says the 2024 DMG will probably have all this in it, but it's too late now since we already have your book. Hey, Brett. Yeah, Blade Runner. Yeah, we were looking at Blade Runner. So when we were looking at this book, and I was reading before we came on, I was actually going through and I was reading part of the chapter on wilderness travel here and going through this. How much of this book is explaining in a better way existing rules, and how much of it is stuff that is your own rules and method of doing things that you're imparting here?
It's a little bit difficult to kind of quantify that. Like we're talking about dungeons, for example. Obviously, I didn't invent the concept of drawing a map, right?
Right.
But there is stuff in the dungeon stuff that is stuff that I've created. So, for example, we talk about how to make nonlinear dungeons, and I didn't create the concept of nonlinear dungeons either. But I did create a taxonomy of like different techniques that you can use, different ways of connecting levels, and so forth. So there's a structure there. Another example of something from the dungeon chapter that I created is the 5+5 adventure recipe for dungeons, which we take 5 featured rooms and 5 scenic rooms, and that's how you build your dungeon up. And there's a whole chapter talking about that in the book. So I think the biggest thing that I think I bring to the table, which is original, is the concept of a scenario structure. The idea that when we talk about a dungeon or we talk about a mystery or we talk about a heist, that it's not actually just the mechanics of the game that determine how those things play out at the table. There's this common saying that like, here's the role-playing game. You can tell the GM whatever you want to do, and the GM can just figure out what happens as a result. And that is sort of the basic concept of a role-playing game. But there's a whole universe of creation and structure that is kind of glossed over when you say, the GM can just figure out what happens in response to what the players say. So an example of like how structure can affect play is like let's talk about dungeons. And we have these assumptions about how a dungeon adventure should work in play. But that's not the only structure we could use to resolve a dungeon crawl. So for example, if a player said, hey, I'm going to head into the Grotto of Gemstones, you immediately think, I'll play that out as this dungeon crawl there'll be a map and a key, and they'll go room by room, and I'll explain each room as they go, and et cetera, et cetera. But you can also say, hey, I want to go have my character explore the Grotto of Gemstones, and the GM might say, okay, well, make a dungeoneering check, and they'd roll the dice, and they'd say 23, and then the GM would say, okay, well, you spend a couple of days in the Grotto of Gemstones, and you clear out all the goblins that are there, and you come out with 719 gold pieces worth of gems. And that would be another way of resolving that action that was proposed by the players. Mm-hmm. And the question of which one of those structures is better is not an objective decision. It is just a subjective one about what's best for the type of adventure, the type of stories, the type of characters that you're telling. And so this is kind of the thing that I think we often overlook as game masters is what is the actual structure of play that is inherent in our scenarios. And that's the big thing that I kind of bring in here with the book is I'm teaching not just like broad concepts of like, hey, a mystery is where you solve a crime. It is a mystery has if you want to resolve a mystery, here is a specific structure that you can use to create the scenario and to run the scenario at the table. And the same thing with dungeons and so forth as well. Into the Wild is actually a great example of this because the book actually contains several different structures for handling wilderness exploration, depending on what type of wilderness exploration and why you're there. So like you have route-based travel, which is if you're going from point A to point B. You can also have a hex crawl, which invites more open-ended exploration of an area. And also point crawls, which is a different way of structuring that exploration of an area as well.
Well, like with the wilderness, I know you were talking about dividing time into watches and what people do on different watches. And like that wasn't in the 5th edition DMG, I don't think.
No, those concepts there in the Into the Wild chapter, those are original stuff that I've developed. I'm certainly influenced by a number of different factors. Older editions of D&D, like 1974 D&D or the 1st edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, those games had more robust procedures, which I have played over the years and certainly influenced the design work that went into the hex crawl structure that I present in the book.
Let me check the comments and say, Frank, welcome, Frank. Frank says the DMG says nothing about how to run a dungeon, but the PHB has the "What is a role-playing game" section in the player's handbook. Presumably because the GM already has that. Now, that's a good point that you do go through this obligatory, what is a role-playing game for a player? Like, what is that? That all of us probably here on the stream have read 50 times by now. What is a role-playing game? So that is often something that's present in the PHBs, but you're right that the equivalent isn't present often in the DMG. That's a very interesting point. Keybounce says, turning a dungeon crawl into just a die roll. It makes sense. The whole question of what is the game? Maybe the game is in the dungeon. Maybe the dungeon is something along the way. Yeah. So yeah, you have to make that call about it's a temporal resolution. Like, okay, I want to raid the dungeon. Do I get the treasure? Well, that could be a roll, or is that an entire sequence of the whole adventure? Yeah. That's we would see it, okay, as a whole sequence of stuff most of the time, but it doesn't have to be that way. And that it doesn't guide you in what exactly is a sequence, what exactly is something that's worthy of resolving on its own. The dungeon might be an extreme example, but probably a better example that comes up is something like wilderness travel. I want to go from here to here. Make a roll. Okay, now you're there, or you're there, or make a roll. Or do I need to do 15 things?
Well, and you can actually see examples of this in other media as well. You have to be a little bit careful in my experience using other mediums as examples for role-playing games, because role-playing games are their own medium. But like, well, for example, like Captain America Civil War. There's a scene about 2/3 of the way through the movie where Captain America and the Black Widow come to Sam Wilson and are like, hey, we need help. And Sam Wilson drops down this dossier that says, hey, I used to have this Falcon suit. And they're like, hey, where is it? He's like, oh, it's like in this military facility. Do you think you could help me get it out? And then like the next scene is they've already done that. And like if you were playing that a role-playing game, you'd have to make a choice. Do I design a whole heist where I have like a military base and the players for Captain America and Black Widow and the Falcon all have to go do that heist to get the wings? Or do I just have Captain America and the Black Widow make heist checks and then we say, great, you've got his wings now and he can go do this? That is a choice about how you want to structure and where the focus of the adventure is going to be. And that will also then influence, what it is that you're prepping, and of course, how you're going to use that prep at the table.
Okay. Well, speaking on the subject of prep then, one subject that we often talk about on the Morning Grind live stream is what's the least you can possibly do to do whatever it is. Effectively have fun. Let's say, what's the least you can possibly? We're sitting down. The goal is we're going to do this role playing game. Everybody's coming over for 3 or 4 hours. I mean, you're the dungeon master, but you got life to live as well. And it's very easy to always think about what's the most I could possibly do. I mean, in every venture that you're doing, whether it's film or YouTube videos or dungeon, it's dungeon mastering. It's very easy to think, when you're just letting your mind go, what's the most I could possibly do in an ideal world? What would I do? Perfectly painted miniatures and Dwarven Forge level, setups for every encounter. It's very easy to go there in your mind, but a better question, I think, is what's the least you could possibly do to accomplish your objective? And let's say your objective is to have an absolutely fantastic time with your friends at the gaming table that night. So what is the least, like, what should you be doing as a game master? If you're the game master, what's the least you should be doing to have an absolutely blast at the table?
Well, I think like the answer can be zero prep at all. We were talking about like games designed for that, which certainly help with that zero prep methodology when they give you some of the tools you need to help you improvise the session at the table. And that kind of is the key in terms of what I think about in terms of prep, which is I think if you're doing prep ahead of a session, you need to focus that prep on things that you cannot improvise equally well at the table. And that is not a one-size-fits-all answer. As someone who has been GMing for 40 years, there's stuff I feel comfortable improvising at the table that a first-time GM is probably not going to feel as comfortable doing. So, for example, there have been pickup sessions I've run of D&D where we've sat down like, oh, I don't have a dungeon. I'm going to take 10 seconds and just quickly sketch out a node map, or even just kind of improvise it as we go through it. And I can do that and have it be pretty effective because I have literally years and years and years of experience running dungeons and learning how to run those scenarios. But if I was a first-time GM, that would probably not be a great way of running a session because I'm not comfortable improvising all that stuff. That can also be a personal thing. So, for example, like me personally, I am terrible at improvising names on the fly. And so one of the things I will take the time to prep is a name list for an RPG that I'm running, whether it's a fantasy game or a sci-fi game or even a modern day game, I'll have a list of names behind the screen that I can refer to if I need to improvise an NPC, for example. But there are other people who have no difficulty improvising names off the top of their head, so that wouldn't be good prep for them. That wouldn't be something that would be a value add at the table. And to kind of go back to Drudenfuss's question earlier about those zero prep games, one of the ways in which zero prep games help the GM do that is by giving them procedural generation tools like random encounter tables, for example, or in the case of Blades in the Dark, for example, Blades in the Dark provides pre-built factions, and you can basically just take a handful of factions and take the tools that John Harper, the designer of the game, gives you, and you can quickly throw together a heist-based scenario using the structures discussed in that game. So these are all tools that will help you improvise, and so those are kind of good things to work with. So there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but the answer can be as little as nothing, and just having confidence in your own skills as an improviser or the like. This is actually something that the book is kind of focused on, because what I've experienced as a game master is that when I understand the structure of how a particular type of adventure works, it's a lot easier for me to improvise with confidence within that structure. So, for example, in the mystery section of the book, I talk about the 3-clue rule, which is a core concept of how to design robust mystery scenarios, which is that for any conclusion you want the players to make, you should include at least 3 clues. Well, if you understand that rule, then you know that when you're designing a scene, for example, and you know that the scene needs to lead the players to another scene, you know it has to have 3 clues. It becomes a lot easier to improvise that scene when you sort of consciously understand what needs to be in this scene. 3 clues need to be in this scene. That's one example. We also take that one step further in the book. So there's these scenario structures, like broadly, like how you run a dungeon or how you run a mystery. But there's also specific adventure recipes in the book. So, for example, for mysteries, there's a recipe that I call the 5-node mystery. And the way that works is basically I say, hey, opening scene, 3 other scenes, and a conclusion. And then you hook them up in a very specific way that's described in the recipe. And what's great about the recipe is structurally, I know that that structure will work. And so what I have is like 5 sort of containers, if you will, 5 scenes that I know if I link them together in this recipe will work. But what I can do is I can pour sort of any creative ingredients into that structure. And that gives me a tool that's, once you know that recipe, can be very powerful for being able to improvise with minimal or no prep at the table, because you know what the structure of play is in this recipe, and you just have to provide the creative content that fills those containers.
There's that, it seems like the idea of what to prep would also tie in with that idea of different toys, that you might want to prep your toys. A particular, okay, there's going to be this particular magic scepter that has this particular power that's resting here. And there's this particular goblin prince that has this particular personality who's here. And to kind of prep those toys and then inject them into the game, but not necessarily, you don't have to prep like what they're going to do, or, you know, in a linear way, or like you prep the toys maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Two great games for this, and I mentioned them a couple times now. Blades in the Dark and Tech Noir both basically do this, where the books are just chock full of the raw toys. And then in both cases, there is a structure that within the games can be used to bring those toys into play in a procedural way. In the case of Blades in the Dark, it's the heist structure. In the case of Tech Noir, it's the plot map that generates the conspiracy that the players are involved in or investigating. But yeah, so again, that's a great example of how you can get to these zero prep games where you have these toys that are baked in and ready to go. Or once you know what you need to prep, you can have those toys on hand. And eventually you may get to a point where you don't necessarily need to prep those toys. You'll know how to improvise those toys and how to use them at the table.
Good evening, PH. Welcome. Glad to have you here. Spine says, your recent article made me think of PCs as dungeons. This is interesting. PCs as dungeons, and that they over time can take on domains or responsibilities that may encounter adversity. How would I consider fairness when NPCs interact? Do you know about this latest article that Spine is referencing here?
Yeah, I'm not sure what he means by PCs as dungeons per se, but I wrote a recent article talking about domain-based play where the PCs actually control a a kingdom or a thieves guild or something of that nature, and that the story becomes about the organization that they're creating and running. Another great game that really, again, I've been talking about Blades in the Dark a lot. I'm a big fan. Blades in the Dark does a great job with this as well, where there's actually structures of play for building that domain and expressing that domain in play.
Charlie has a great question here. It says, question, when prepping a session, if you have a block or get stuck, what do you use to spark the creative juices?
That's a great question, Charlie. To some extent, this depends on how much time I have to get sparked. Like if it's the day of the game, I need to get sparked pretty quick. If I've got a few days, the best thing I found is to walk away and read another book, watch a movie. Particularly valuable can be making sure you do that outside of whatever genre you're running a game in. So if I'm running a fantasy game, for example, I can get inspired reading like Stephen Brustfeld, Vlad Tolstoy series, or George R. R. Martin, for example. But I may actually get more inspired reading a nonfiction book about the Middle Ages, or even a nonfiction book about, I don't know, like exploring Saturn, for example, that might inspire me in unusual ways. I like bringing in information from unusual vectors. That's what I find really sparks creativity. The other thing you can do, though, is if you're on a short list, this comes back to these procedural generators that used to be more ubiquitous in games, but have kind of fallen away a bit. But for example, like if I need an adventure, for example. One example I give in the book about how to come up with adventures is, one way you can think about adventure, there are several, but one way you can think about them is, what is the goal? What are the players seeking in this adventure? And you can, for example, in D&D has a whole section of magic items. Well, magic items are cool. People want them, and you can do things with them. So you can just randomly pick a magic item, and then you can ask yourself, okay, well, who would have this magic item? What are they currently doing with it? And that is a way to begin sparking that adventure and moving it forwards.
Let's go then into some maybe controversial opinions or topics in game mastering. We had some of those this morning.
Are we going to ruffle some
I wrote down a
now?
bunch of different topics. I was like, what are the most controversial things that we could possibly talk about? I tell you what, why don't we start with failing forward? The idea of failing forward. Because it seems like people are rather passionate about whether they like that or don't like that, or what that means, or the proper way to implement that on the game. You did talk about failing forward when we were talking about, or you talked about the yes and yes, but no, but when we're talking in the early days or the early pages of the book that we went over on the morning grind here. And some people were like, oh, kind of like failing forward. What is your perspective on that mechanic in games?
Yeah, so I kind of define the term real quick. So failing forward is a situation where when you frame the stakes of the check, what will happen as a result of the check, you frame mechanical failure as a success with consequence. The classic example that always gets rolled out is like picking a lock. So if you use, and to contrast that, we'll just use like binary outcomes. So a binary outcome is when you succeed or you fail. So if you're at a door and you're trying to pick the lock on the door, and you make a lock picking check in your system of choice, and that check succeeds, obviously you pick the lock, great. If you fail, then you didn't pick the lock. And where that technique can fall into difficulty is, okay, well, what happens then? And what may happen is that the player just says, okay, well, I'm going to try and pick the lock again. And they just keep doing that until they finally roll a successful check. And that's not really a great use of anyone's time, right? You're just sitting there rolling over and over again. And so there's a few ways that you can get out of that. One would be that you say, looking at what's happening now, say, okay, well, there's no reason why you can't spend as long as you need to rolling the dice over and over again to pick this lock. And I can see that you're skilled enough that if you keep rolling long enough, you will eventually roll a success. So let's not roll the dice at all. Let's just say, yes, you spend a little time, you pick the lock. You're an expert lock picker. You can do that. That's one option, right? Another option is to say, okay, actually, that dice roll is representing whether or not your character is capable of picking this specific lock at this specific time. And so if you fail that check, the check isn't just telling us, hey, you failed this one time. The check is telling us you cannot pick this lock. And so
this is beyond your skill level.
Beyond your skill level, the circumstances are wrong. Whatever the case may be inside that lock, you can't do it. And so I say, okay, well, in that case, that means when you fail, you you fail and you can't try again. You'll have to find a different way. So those are different options. The third option is this failing forward concept. And what you do there is, like I said, you, instead of saying that a mechanical failure where you roll lower than the difficulty on the dice, for example, that mechanical failure, rather than being a failure, is a success, but there are consequences. And so, so for example, if you succeed on the check, you still open the lock. If you fail on the check, you do open the lock, but some additional consequence happens. Maybe you open the lock, but your lock pick is damaged, and so future lock picking checks will be made at disadvantage until you can replace your lock picks. Or you open the lock, but it took so long that the security guards there's a security guard who walks around the corner and sees you as you're opening the door. Or it took so long that you've chewed up a bunch of time because, like, maybe your hacker has hacked the security cameras, and the cameras are going to be offline for 20 minutes, and it took you 15 minutes to pick the lock because you failed the check, and so you have very little time left for the heist. So there's all different kinds of consequences based on what type of thing you're doing. Another example I use too is, like, so you jump over a chasm to try and get to the other side. Well, if you succeed, you make it. If you fail, well, you could plummet to your death, or we could frame that as failing forward, and you land on the edge and just barely hold on, and now we'll need to try and pull yourself up. There's some sort of cost or consequence that needs to be overcome. So I'm a big fan of failing forward. It's not something I think should be necessarily applied to every single check. It can be situational. But when used appropriately, it's a great way of making sure that the game has a forward momentum and you don't get stuck into these weird, like, roll the dice over and over again for no particular reason, if that makes sense.
Oh, right. So, but okay. So here is, I mean, I'm generally in favor of it, but I also understand this common critique of it. That it seems like a lot of people were like, okay, so a common example might be, okay, you're going to try to do a climbing check to climb the side of this mountain. Okay. And maybe you fail. It's like, well, does that mean you fall off the mountain or whatever? You can't do it. Okay. Well, maybe you are going to climb the mountain, but you have some kind of complication. And like, okay, well, the game master's like, okay, well, let's fail forward. So you failed the check, but you do climb the mountain. But then once you get to the top of the mountain, you're attacked by pterodactyls. And you got to fight these pterodactyls. Now, there's another thing about how meaningful combat is in different particular games. But let's say that's a meaningful consequence. But I think some players, which I'm sympathetic to, would be like, in that case, how exactly did my ability to climb this mountain result in a pterodactyl on the top of it? There's some verisimilitude there that they're not buying into.
Well, I think that's fair. I mean, part of using the technique correctly is making sure that you as the GM are framing it in a way that makes sense within the context of the world. So why? So, for example, also explaining why is always a good thing, right? So, for example, in this case, you might say, okay, why did pterodactyls show up and attack you because you rolled poorly in a climb check? And there'd be a couple ways I could frame that. One might be, I'd say, okay, well, you took so long climbing that the sun began to set and the pterodactyls come out at night. And so you take so long climbing the mountain that you're still on the cliff face when the pterodactyls fly out looking for food. And hey, look, tasty morsels on the side of the mountain. It's snack time. Another thing you can say is, okay, you're climbing the mountain, but you're so clumsy climbing the mountain, you keep kicking rocks down below. And unbeknownst to you, there's a pterodactyl nest down there that you're kicking the rocks down into. And so now you've pissed off the pterodactyls who are flying up to protect their nest. So just taking that example, there's a couple different ways you could kind of make sure that there is a logical progression to that. The other thing to keep in mind, like, for example, in the lockpicking example where you rolled so poorly that the guard came around the corner, part of it is like, the way I think of dice rolls in role-playing games is that they are trying to capture the complex reality of the fictional universe. Like, in a hypothetical situation, we would know everything about that universe and we would just know the outcome ahead of time because we've accounted for every factor, including your skill. But realistically, we can't do that. So we roll the dice to capture a whole multitude of randomness and chaos in the world. Is the grounds, did you miss the orc because the orc parried, or because you slipped in the dirt, or, the sun hit your eyes at the wrong moment? There's all kinds of explanations you can give for why, for example, sword swing misses, and that applies to any check in general. So in the case of like a security guard coming around the corner, I don't necessarily know where the security guards are in the complex. It's okay for the dice to be the one that tells me, oh, it turns out the guard is here, or it turns out the pterodactyls are here. But if that's not working, there are other ways that you could also frame those fail forwards on the cliff climbing, for example, where instead of pterodactyls, it's just the amount of time it took, if that's relevant, or damage you took as a result of going up the cliff and climbing badly, or you get up the cliff but you are suffering from hypoxia or exhaustion. You're going to be at disadvantage on your checks for a while. There's a lot of different ways that you can have those consequences, and it really is just about making sure that the consequences you come up with do in fact make sense and flow logically from the narrative situation.
Druden Fuzz says, I'm not sure I clearly understand this, but Druden Fuzz says, I like failing forward, but I think it's just a patch on the underlying issue of the ableism in game design we have so prevalent in the hobby.
I was seeing that as well, and I'd really love it if Druden Fuzz could expand on that.
I was going to say the same thing. Could you expand on that and put it in the comments, because I'm not exactly sure where you're going with that. TSL Frotman says, time spent static is a great threat assessment tool for just about anything the heroes can probably do eventually. Yeah, and if you can do it eventually, why roll for it? But that actually goes to one of the things that I talk about a lot on the Morning Grind, and we talk about that time is underused in RPGs in general. Because, yes, you might be able to do it eventually, so there is no need to roll, because you will get it done. But the question is, time should be a resource that's expended, and that should matter.
And there certainly are situations where it just, it isn't going to matter. But like you said, I think it is underutilized. Like this one I talk about specifically in the dungeon chapter, So You Want to Be a Game Master, because I think when you don't use time as a pressure in a dungeon, there's a lot of things in the dungeon that become much less effective. And this can have very unexpected knock-on effects. So for example, why are traps so often seen as sort of this boring mechanic in 5th edition, for example? And it's because in the structure of the way most people run dungeons these days, for better or worse, time isn't a factor. It isn't a pressure. All the monsters wait in their rooms very politely, waiting for you to show up. That wasn't the case in 1974, for example, when there were this specific time pressure where everything you did in the dungeon cost you time. And the more time you spent in the dungeon, the more likely you were to run into wandering encounters that could kill you. And that is a very different mindset to be under. And so in the case for traps, for example, when you're under time pressure and searching for traps means that you are spending time doing that is going to potentially cost you in other ways, you now have to make strategically interesting choices about where you're going to search for traps. And as soon as you have to make those choices, that is the first step in making traps an interactive experience for the players, rather than something that they just endure because you roll dice and tell them what happens.
So what is, I have that on my list of topics here. What is the most effective way to use traps in the game today? Like, how do you use them then to make sure they're important and that they're meaningful and not just an annoyance?
Yeah, so I have actually a pretty long essay on my website called Rulings in Practice Traps, which may be worth checking out if people are specifically interested in this. But the short version is that if you read the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, it has a description of how you're supposed to mechanically resolve a trap. And what they tell you to do is they tell you, okay, so you're going through the dungeon, you should use the PC's passive perception score to see if they can notice the trap to begin with. If they do, then you should use, I think it's an intelligence investigation check to see if they can figure out how to disable the trap. And then you make an appropriate skill check, probably Dexterity Thieves tools, to see if you can actually disable the trap, having figured out how to do it. And that is, whether you're talking about traps or anything else, in my opinion, almost an objectively bad way of doing it. Because the one thing to note in that entire sequence of things is that the players never actually made a choice. Their passive perception score detected the trap. They maybe have to say, hey, let's investigate the trap, but that's just rote. That's just a rote thing they're going to say. So there's no choices.
Weird. Oh, I'll investigate. Right. Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, and you can imagine, like I said, it's not just traps. It's not just that this makes traps boring or make anything boring. Like, can you imagine a social encounter where you're like, okay, so the first thing is I'm going to use your passive insight score to see if you can figure out what you should say to this person. And then you make a charisma check to see if you say it successfully. And at no point in there do the players ever make a decision about saying it or having it. It's just automatically like the mechanics roll out. And if you roll poorly, maybe you get some damage. Like that's why traps are boring. So at every phase there, you really need to figure out how to make choices. And so, like I say, the first step in that is if you have time as a pressure in the dungeon, then the way that the trap can work is that the first step is that you can't just be constantly searching for traps. You have to make a strategic choice about, this corridor looks suspicious, this one's probably safe. How am I going to use this resource of time? How am I going to spend time as a resource in order to use that time effectively? Now, the next thing is that once you have made that decision to search, and if you do find the trap, then the question then becomes, how do you actually resolve the trap itself? And what you want to have, what you really want to make sure you have there is an understanding of how the trap works in the game world, so that the players can interact with that trap in some way other than just rote mechanical checks. And there's a number of ways that this can work. There's not one specific formula, but what I like to say, if you get the mix right, then your players will start saying things like, I'm going to pour water on the floor to see if it runs down through any crevices in the floor and reveals that there's a pit trap there. Or they'll say, I'm not going to make a disable check. I'm just going to lay a board across the top of the pit trap. Or they'll say things like, I'm going to try and harvest the alchemist's fire from this fire trap so I can pour it down the arrow holes of the arrow trap 2 rooms over. So this idea that you interact with these traps in ways that aren't just this pure rote mechanical step is really the key to all of it. So there's an article on my website. There's also a section of the book that talks about this as well, and different ways of building those traps and thinking about how those traps trigger. The last phase too is it's also any trap that, like, we get a lot of bang traps where you make the die rolls and either the trap hits you or it doesn't. It can often be more interesting to have a trap that creates an interesting situation. And again, this is in some cases, this is like a fail forward thing where, for example, one of the most interesting things you can do owning a trap is when someone fails to perceive it and they trigger the trap, don't say, hey, you step on a plate and arrows shoot at you. You instead say you're walking down the hallway when you feel a pressure plate give way under your foot and there's a click. What do you do? And what do they do? Do they try and like figure out, like it's like the classic scene of someone stepping on a mine, right? And then having to try and disable the mine or being stuck there or whatever. That instantly is more interesting than just a simple failure state. Other examples include things like you trigger the trap and the room starts filling up with water, right? So there's a situation that the PCs have to react to. Combining traps into combat is also a great way of doing this, because the bad guys can use the traps to their advantage, or maybe the PCs can figure out where the traps are and they can use the traps to their advantage. So you really want to have traps that are just more interactive rather than just this rote mechanical catchism.
All right, let's actually, Sable says time pressure is one of the big reasons that Shadow Dark was so successful, I think. Drudenfuzz says, with ableism, I mean that it's all framed only about what the characters are capable of doing. We always roll of their abilities to overcome things.
Well, this is something I talk about in the book too, which is that is an easy trap to fall into, is that because in most systems you are having the player roll a die to see how well their character does, you will usually end up defaulting to the idea that if the dice roll poorly, it means that their character did something bad. Or if the dice rolled well, it means that that the skill of the character is really good. And breaking out of that, and that's true to some extent. Character skill is variability in character skill is one of the things we use dice to represent. But you can also break out of that limitation, because there's other factors that can be modeled by the dice. And once you kind of accept that can be the environmental factors, it can be luck. It can be the other character's skill if you're rolling against somebody, for example. That opens up a much wider palette for you as the game master to describe the outcomes of actions. And that can be really useful, in my experience, in terms of making I want to say, in terms of making action resolution in the game more interesting on its face value, it's also kind of a relief. It's also really nice, and particularly in some genres, for players to feel competent even if they're failing. Where it's not because your paladin like tripped over his own feet and like made an embarrassment of himself that he missed the orc. He missed the orc because the orc parried his mighty blow, and now the orc is extra scary because he's just that good at fighting, and now we've got an epic battle between two competent people. So yeah, so I think you're 100% right that we default into assigning everything as being, is the character doing well or not, that variability of skill. But there is a much wider palette that you can access if you can break out of that default.
Okay, what about the subject of fudging dice rolls at the table? It's another controversial one right here. So you've got a strong opinion on it, right?
I do, and we may ruffle some feathers here.
Okay.
My broad thing is that in general, your goal should be to not fudge dice rolls, and that my least controversial way of saying this is that if you fudge a dice roll at the table, every single time you fudge a dice roll, it means that something went wrong. There was a mistake or something broken that you are trying to fix by fudging that dice roll. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you should never fudge the dice, but it means that your goal should be to never fudge the dice, because ideally you will have never made a mistake and you will have never had something broken to begin with. And if you do fudge the dice, you should try to figure out, why did I have to fudge that outcome? And how can I fix things so that in the future, I don't have to fudge that roll again? And like the easiest example of this is before you roll the dice, think about what the outcome of the dice is. What does success look like? And what does failure look like? And you have to ask yourself, am I okay with both of those outcomes? And do I think that the table will be okay with both of those outcomes? And if the answer is no, if I'm not going to be okay with failure, for example, or if I'm not going to be okay with success, then those dice should not be rolled. Either you should default to whatever the outcome that everyone's going to be okay with is, or that you're okay with, or you need to reframe the stakes of the check, possibly through failing forward, for example, in order to create a situation where you are okay with all the possible outcomes of that dice roll. And so that's a really basic example. Another example of where fudging sometimes comes in is like, okay, so you're in a combat encounter and you feel like you need to start fudging dice rolls because the combat encounter has gone in the wrong direction. Maybe you're at a table where TPKs are never okay, and a TPK is imminent, so you need to start fudging dice rolls, for example. And you need to ask yourself, okay, well, why did the encounter end up there, and how could I run better encounters in the future so I wouldn't need to fudge the dice in order to have the encounters land within parameters that I'm comfortable with? How could I change the game system that I'm using or change the encounters that I'm building in order to not have to fudge the dice in the first place? So that's really where I come from fudging, is that the goal is to never fudge. If you fudged, something is wrong, and you should use that as a diagnostic tool to become a better game master in the future.
Charlie says, Justin, that's a fantastic way to explain dice fudging, why you should or should not do it. So you guys are a fan right there with Justin. Sables must be a harsh DM. Sable says TPKs are always okay. On that subject of the dice fudging, on the Heath's Geekverse channel, I did a deep dive, a series of a whole bunch of different videos into dice probability and trying to figure out dice and the way they're interacting with different, resolution mechanics and so forth. And in an attempt to reduce randomness. So this may be a reason why sometimes people need to fudge dice, because my goal in game design has been to reduce randomness. That does not mean eliminate randomness, as I say reduce randomness, and then people in YouTube comments will say, well, then just play a diceless game or something like that. No, reduce randomness, but not eliminate randomness. But like even in the charts in your book, they're like, if you've got an easy task and it's a 50-50 coin flip, does that mean that we need to be reevaluating our dice mechanics and our probability tables? Or like, if this is supposed to be something that's easy, does it really make sense that I got a coin flip on whether or not a hero can do it? Should that be a 90% chance? If it's something that's easy, is part of my problem that, gee, easy things, they fail 50% of the time and they're stumbling around all over the place.
Yeah, I think that's 100% correct. I mean, if we narrowly talk, I mean, this is a problem across many role-playing games, is you'll get a table of difficulties or like modifiers or whatever the case may be in the system of choice, and there'll be some text label. And the first problem you have is, well, like the subjectiveness of the text label. Okay, so like this is difficult and this is challenging. Without seeing the table, I couldn't even tell you which order those two would necessarily go in, right? Like, is difficult more difficult than challenging, or is challenging more challenging? I don't know. So there's a subjectivity in there. And then also, like, what are we scaling to? Easy under what conditions? Easy for who? And so there's always that, frequently in role-playing games, there's that missing component of like, okay, you say easy, but easy for, like I say, who? Who is it easy for? First level character, an NPC, a 10th level character? Those are probably different things. Right? Is it easy for Superman or is it easy for Lois Lane? Like those are two different characters. What does that mean?
And is it easy when you're just in your living room taking care of it, you know, or is it easy when you've got orcs storming in the door, you know, and you're also.
So like you actually, one of the things I talk about in the book is I have some tables there that use 5th edition D&D as the model for them. But they're tables I often construct for a variety of games that I run, where I actually break down like, okay, well, what are the actual percentages of success for various characters in this? And then I create a structure that lets me both try to model who a check is easy for, like who do I expect to succeed on this check most of the time, and also so the two things I look at is like who could succeed on this check most of the time, which I usually define as like 75-80% of the time, because I find that to be a useful metric when I'm thinking about, okay, well, who, like if I think about like a chasm, for example, jumping up a chasm, like is this something like anybody could do, or is it something an Olympic athlete could do, or would you need to be like Hercules to do it? Like what's that scale? The other thing that I find useful when making rulings on what the difficulty for a check should be is to also think in terms of what, in order to succeed on this at all, how talented would you need to be, and also who could succeed on this check every single time. Like, for example, jumping over, I'm going to use chasms again, but like jumping over a short chasm might be easy for, or it might be a difficult chasm for like an average person. But if you were like a master martial artist, you know, or Batman, like that might be the level where you could automatically jump over that chasm every single time. And having those different parameters is something I find useful in terms of like trying to figure out, well, when I'm making a ruling, I find those to be useful categories to think about. The other place where we fall down in terms of probability is what I call rolling to failure, because people really underestimate when you have a sequence of rolls and you have to succeed on every single one of them in order to succeed, how quickly good odds turn into crap odds.
Yes.
If you have to roll 3 or 4 or 5 times in a row, or like stealth is a classic example of this. You'll end up with game masters who are like, why do my players never sneak anywhere? And I'll say, well, how are you resolving stealth checks? And they're like, well, everybody rolls their stealth check, and then everybody who's trying to spot them will roll their spot check. And if anybody fails against anybody else, then they get spotted. I'm like, well, that's why they're not stealthing, because there's no way that they can succeed on that check over time, particularly when you then ask them to make the check again every round.
Next turn, right?
Yeah, like, oh, I have to do a best of 5 versus the worst of 5, and I have to do that I'm not going to sneak
4 turns in a row or something to get up to the dungeon. Yeah, or the
so like
or whatever.
if you flip to page 282 of So You Want to Be a Game Master, I talk about rolling to failure, and I talk about a concept called letting it ride. And letting it ride says, so first off, don't just keep making stealth check after stealth check after stealth check. Make one stealth check and say, okay, so James Bond, you've made a stealth check to sneak into the villain's lair. That check determines how good your stealth is for getting into the villain's lair. It rides through the entire. We will ride that check through the entire infiltration mission. I won't ask you to keep rolling it over and over again. It informs us how well this specific attempt is going to go. The other thing you can also do to kind of lessen that as well is to create a point of uncertainty. I kind of talked about this with the traps earlier, where instead of having the failure to detect the trap be the trap explodes, the failure to detect the trap can be you hear a click under your boot. You can do the same thing like with stealth, for example, where you, instead of having the failure state of a stealth check be, oh, you failed your stealth check, so the security guard spots you, the failure of the stealth check can be, you hear a security guard coming from around the corner. What do you do? So that point of uncertainty gives the players a chance to come up with some creative way of overcoming the failure. And the one key thing there is that if you fail a stealth check, for example, the way that you avoid the failure should not be just make another stealth check. It should be, you need to jump out the window and hang from the balcony, so make an athletics check, or you quickly throw on a disguise, so make a disguise check, or something along those lines. You need to think of a different way of approaching the problem. But that's another way that you can kind of help deal with some of those problems of probability.
What are your thoughts on knowledge checks? How do you adjudicate knowledge checks, and whether or not you should even have them? I mean, that's a controversial topic too. How do you adjudicate knowledge in your games?
So typically what I end up doing with like knowledge checks is I do use knowledge checks, and part of this is like, so let me back up one step. Going back to what we were just talking about, I think it's important to identify in general what stuff actually needs a check. Like one thing you talked about in the section of the book you looked at this morning, for example, is the concept of defaulting to yes. That in general, a GM's response to anything that players say, the first thing you should say is there any reason I can't say yes to this? And usually the answer is no, so you should go ahead and say yes. And like the example often given in role-playing game manuals is like, so the PCs want to cross the street. Don't call for an athletics check. They can just cross the street. That's something anybody can do. And what I think can be really eye-opening as a game master is to think about, okay, but now I'm playing Green Lantern or Superman or Hercules or a 15th level D&D character. What are the things that they don't actually need to make those checks for? You actually want to think about that in terms of making those rulings. And knowledge checks is a place where I think sometimes we can kind of fall into a trap where like things that anybody who is familiar with arcane lore should just be automatic. You don't necessarily make that check. But I will make checks because there's lots of stuff where I'm like, okay, well, maybe not everybody would know this, or not every scholar, not every spellcaster would know this, for example. But there's a couple things that let me get away with that. One is that the 3-clue rule I was talking about earlier. Like one trap you can fall into is if you only have a single point of failure where you have to know this piece of information in order to proceed with the adventure, you don't make that check. You have to, if you're at a single point of failure and the only outcome you're going to be comfortable with is success, again, you have to just go with the success. So by using the 3-clue rule, for example, it's okay to sometimes miss clues because that's the whole point of having that redundancy. And that can be interesting because it creates variations in what happens at the table. So that's why I'm comfortable using knowledge checks, is because usually I have some backup for that, and I'm only using them for things where they're not essential knowledge that the PCs have to have, and it's just interesting to kind of like see whether or not people know things. For the same reason, it's interesting to know whether or not they can jump over that chasm or whether or not they can pick that lock. And if those are the types of knowledge checks you're doing where like it's interesting either way, whether they know this or they don't, then the check becomes viable, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, here I got one more question for you, though. This one's on the social side of things. We talked about a lot about the mechanical stuff on of the games, but on the social side of things, which was an interesting thing that was brought up this morning, how do you deal with people's dates at the table? Or is that something that you encounter, or is there some kind of protocol that we should be implementing?
I mean, any activity you do, you want everyone to be interested in doing that activity, right? And I think it's kind of the subtext. Sometimes when people talk about people bringing dates to the table and that being a bad experience, is that they're bringing somebody in who isn't actually interested in this activity. And like a role-playing game is frequently, particularly the way most people play them, it's a very long-term commitment. Like if somebody doesn't like going fishing, for example, it might be okay to ask them to like come out on the boat one day and see and just hang out for a bit. They might be okay with that. But like a role-playing game, oftentimes they're like, hey, can you come out every Friday for the next 18 months?
Right.
And like that's a tough ask. So that's it. I mean, so the one thing though is that like the best way of doing that is to be such an amazing game master that the game is entertaining to everybody, and instantaneously that date is going to want to play the game because you've made them fall in love with role-playing games. So problem solved. And this book is actually kind of a dating guide when you think about it in that sense. No, so I mean that's the one thing. It's like you don't want anyone at the table, whether they're a date or not, that isn't actually interested in being there. And so that can be an issue. Now, I will say, like, I've personally had pretty good success with people bringing dates to tables, although frequently those dates are people who already play role-playing games. So, for example, I have a D&D campaign I've been running since 2007. And the people at that table, there have been two different couples who were not married when the game started, and in fact in one case weren't dating when the game started, and they are now married. So those are pretty good odds, and they all seem to enjoy the game still, since they're still playing it with me 16 years later. So
that's success. That's some success. Yes.
Or they're faking it really well. So
very well. Right. Yes. All right, well, let me this has been fantastic. I have really enjoyed talking to you. Let me bring up the screen with the different links and stuff like that. You want to close this out? Well, I got the wrong thing here. Oh, yeah. So that could be that's the next book. So you want to be a marriage maker. That's right. I like that.
I will pitch that to Elliot at Page Tree Publishing, see if they go for it.
So if you are interested, so you want to be a game master. Now you can also order this from your friendly local gaming store, right?
That's right. Local game stores, your favorite local bookstore. It's both. It's like I say, it's being distributed by Macmillan, which is one of the big 5 publishers. So it's going to be in all mainstream bookstores or websites like Amazon or Chapters or Barnes and Noble. And then, ACD distribution at least. And I think a couple others may have also picked it up by now for game distribution, which means your local game store can get it, even if they don't normally get in mainstream books.
Okay, so it's not essential to get it from Amazon, but I put the Amazon link, but you can get it from other places. If you want to support the local bookstores, local hobby shops, you can get it from there as well.
That's great.
But that is the link. If you don't have one of those around, it is on pre-order right now. So it comes out the 21st, it says.
Yeah, it's just a couple weeks away. Very exciting.
And then also, of course, if you've enjoyed Justin's commentary, Justin on YouTube, hey, you can watch a lot more of him.
If you're not tired of listening to my voice yet, there's so much more of my voice that you can enjoy.
There's a lot of stuff over there. And then, so I just put that in there again. And then also the Alexandrian, the blog, which has fantastic stuff, including, what was that? The Dungeon Master's Guide on an index card. No, DMG on an index card, on a business card.
That's not me. I've talked about that on my site, but the blog of Holding is the one who does
we got that wrong this morning. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right. No, yeah. I tried to correct that this morning as well, but no, I'm a big fan of that, and I've used that math. I have a bunch of 5th edition monsters. I use that note card for building those. But
okay, so the blog is the Alexandrian right there. I just put that in. I guess I should also tell people that if you are interested, if you're here and you would like, please do like the stream, of course. If you're interested in being a part of the Ravenkeep Discord server, Ravenkeep is the Discord server that I run. So there's a link in the chat for the Ravenkeep Discord server. And then also, I have been working on getting my web show back up on YouTube, The Cultists. This is my web show. This is my web show of a mockumentary style comedy of Lovecraftian cultists who are just trying to worship Cthulhu in a world full of people who don't understand. The director and I have been working on relaunching the entire web series. We got 2 seasons of this web series to launch. We've been going through all the videos, updating, doing re-edits of the sounds. The sound will be even better, and for a complete relaunch of the cultists here. So we've got the trailer on that channel right there, and also the first 3 episodes of season 1 that are up there. I just put them up there like 3 hours ago. So that's the final version. That's their home. So please come by The Cultists if you are interested in Lovecraftian comedy. And then also my story, The Trial of St. Gabriel. This is the dark story of the Christmas massacre, which is not something that is often talked about in general Christmas stories, but The Trial of St. Gabriel, a dark short story of the Bethlehem Christmas massacre, I'm going to bring to Kickstarter in about a week or a week and a half. Been working on all that too. Please come by, check that out, notify me on launch. Please click that button if you're interested. We got 10 followers now, so fantastic. Thank you, everybody. So yes, this is a short story that addresses the dark side of Christmas. So please come and check that out as well, and definitely check out So You Want to Be a Game Master, because it seems like to be the book that the Dungeon Master's Guide should have been. So thank you so much for writing it.
Well, I hope everyone enjoys it. I really hope it gets out there and helps people run the best games they can.
All right, is there anything else people need to know before we close out? Anything?
I think you've done a wonderful job covering it. I've just had a really great time hanging out with everybody, and great questions from the chat too. Really appreciate those deep questions that they're diving into.
I've had a fantastic time talking with you as well. And yes, we got a fantastic crew. If you're here, please do like and subscribe, because we got a fantastic group who meets for Table Talk and for the Morning Grind in the morning. We have great conversations on all the different live streams, and we go deep into different subjects. So if you're into that and you're new here, maybe you're from Justin's Discord server, I'd love to have you on Table Talk and the Morning Grind in the mornings. Well, so I'll be live at 9:30 a.m. Central, 9:30 a.m. Central for the Morning Grind tomorrow.
I was in the Morning Grind this morning, and if those who are interested in the book should definitely check that out, because I think Heath did one of the best sort of sneak peeks at the book we've seen so far online. So definitely the place to go if you want to see a little bit more before getting your own copy.
Thank you. So that's it. If you look for the Morning Grind, So You Want to Be a Game Master, yep, that's it right there. So thank you. I appreciate that. The compliment. All right, everybody, thank you so much for being here. And if you're watching on replay, thank you for being here as well. Whether you're live or on replay, thank you so much. I will see everybody tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. for the Morning Grind. Thank you so much, Justin.